In a desolate, war-torn world, a young boy destined for darkness and misery was born from the hanging corpse of his mother, found under a tree by a band of mercenaries. This boy was Guts. He was adopted by a woman named Shisu, who was still mourning a recent miscarriage. Her partner, the mercenary leader Gambino, amongst others in the crew, treated Guts like a cursed child, claiming him to be a bad omen. Thus, the only kindness he knew came from his adoptive mother. However, a taste of the life Guts was destined to live came next, as his beloved Shisu didn't last long before she died of the plague. Nonetheless, over the course of the following years, Guts grew up amidst the brutality of battle and learned to wield a sword far larger than any child his age should. He fought alongside Gambino's group from a young age, hardened by his violent upbringing, becoming accustomed to nothing but swinging a sword as a means of survival. However, his life takes a turn for the worse when Gambino, who blames Guts for Shisu's death, sells his body to another mercenary called Donovan, who abuses the young boy against his will. Thus, Guts kills the man, and later, after a plethora of battles over the years in a rage-fueled confrontation, accidentally kills Gambino as well, who in a drunken fit tried to kill Guts for all the bad luck he's brought him. This leaves Guts fleeing into the night with the rest of Gambino's group hunting him down as a traitor. Therefore, he was now a lone mercenary without a home or purpose. All he had left was all he knew: survival by killing others, fighting battle after battle, with no goal other than to live through each day. That would be until an encounter years later that would not just change Guts' life, but everybody's. That's because Guts had now grown into a formidable warrior, with his skills leading to him killing Bazuso, a hulking man who had famously killed 30 men on his own in the past. Whilst his fellow mercenaries surged forward like a tidal wave, flooding the castle and crushing what little defense remained, the band of the Hawk watched on. Could he be as strong as Griffith? That was the question on everyone's lips as they withdrew into the shadows. When the dust settled and the battle's echoes faded into the cold wind, Guts collected his money for the job, with his employer begging him to stay with them. Nonetheless, Guts continued on as a lone wolf. In spite of this, the man's grip tightened on Guts' shoulder, and in that instance, something dark flickered in Guts' eyes as his childhood trauma momentarily came back to him. Thus, he violently shook off the man's hand, demanding he never touch him again. Far beyond the castle battleground was the band of the Hawk. Amongst them was Caucus, eyes sharp as he spotted Guts walking alone a nearby path, his prize from the raid still in hand. And so, overcome with a sense of greed, he rallied together a small group with the leader's permission to ambush the lone swordsman. Bad idea. Guts sensed their approach, and in mere heartbeats, the first attacker fell, blood spraying as Dante's body crumpled. The second mercenary barely had time to scream before his legs buckled under the weight of Guts' crushing blow. Thus, Caucus froze, with his greed swiftly turning to fear. But before Guts could strike again, a flash cut through the air. An arrow, swift and true, pierced his arm. As he looked for who was next on his hit list, Guts locked eyes with Casca, the second in command to Griffith, and a woman that would change his life. But first, she had one job: stop him. The two clashed with neither willing to yield. However, when Casca's horse fell, she too crashed to the ground. Guts prepared for the killing blow until he saw her face. She was a woman, and still, she had nearly bested him. Suddenly, a spear pierced the ground between them as Griffith stepped forward. In a flash, the ethereal leader of the band of the Hawk's rapier struck Guts. Bleeding and broken, he forced himself to rise, sword still in hand. But it was useless. Guts collapsed with the last thing he saw being Griffith's face. It was in stark contrast to his own. It was clear, glistening, and compassionate. At least, it was for now. In the darkness of his mind, Guts was haunted by his childhood trauma. However, from the shadows, Casca emerged, her body pressed against his. Guts jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His mind was crumbling, putting together the pieces of what happened. Ignoring the searing ache in his body, he stepped out into the cold morning air. The camp was alive with the sounds of mercenaries, most of them barely older than he was, much to his surprise. They were youthful faces that, like him, had already seen far too much of war. Nonetheless, Casca soon made her way over as Guts braced himself, recognizing her from the dream, but was still caught off guard when her fist slammed into his gut, with her wishing Guts had died. Judo, one of the more amicable mercenaries, explained to Guts why she was like this, as Casca wasn't just angry, she'd given up being a woman to become a soldier. For 2 nights she had slept beside Guts, naked at Griffith's order to keep him warm. There was little time to dwell on this information though, as Griffith soon approached, handing Guts back his blade. As they moved through the camp, the eyes of the Band of the Hawk followed. Curious, suspicious, and full of judgment. It was here that Griffith explained the origins of his mercenary group, to which Guts admitted to having heard rumours of their talents. But that was when Griffith finally revealed his true intentions. He had spared Guts because he wanted him to become part of his ranks. In spite of this, Guts had no intention of serving anyone. Thus, he would repay Griffith in the only way he knew, by driving his sword through the man's chest. It was time for them to continue their duel. But this time, their futures were on the line. If Guts wins, he continues on as a lone swordsman. But should he lose, he would join Griffith and his men. And lose he did. Or at least, he should have. But Guts, being the way he was, with blood in his mouth and rage in his heart, bit down on Griffith's blade. The 2 men tumbled down the hill, with Guts unleashing a flurry of punches. Each strike landed with the force of a man who had never known defeat, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed like Guts had continued that streak. No one had ever knocked Griffith down before, but he had done the impossible. Nevertheless, Guts' advantage didn't last long. Griffith caught Guts' next punch and twisted his arm, and with little hesitation, he dislocated it. Griffith had won. Casca watched on from the hilltop as a wave of jealousy and confusion washed over her. The man she would happily die for, the man her heart and soul belonged to, had never shown this level of interest in anyone before. Later that night, Guts sat alone in his tent, overhearing the words of Corcus and several other mercenaries. They planned to kill him. However, even with his injuries, Guts had no doubt that he could handle them. But just as he was about to get the job done, Casca intervened, explaining how they stood no chance, and so they reluctantly backed down. This was no act of care from her though, it was merely another order from Griffith. And so despite now being part of the Band of the Hawk, Guts still felt alone. Thus he clung to the only thing that's been there for him since the beginning. His sword. The next morning brought no comfort, only the promise of blood, as Guts' first mission as part of Griffith's group had arrived. A night raid on an enemy encampment, vastly outnumbered. The employer's faith in Griffith was absolute, and that faith had been transferred to Guts as well, who had been placed in charge of the rear guard. As the night deepened, Griffith moved with Judo and a small group along the river to flank the enemy. Guts, watching from his position, couldn't help but be impressed by the intricacy of Griffith's plan, the precision of the maneuver, the way he turned the environment to their advantage. It was clear that, despite not coming from any esteemed family or nobility, Griffith was more than just a leader. He was a prodigious tactician with a mind built for war. Thus he commanded the charge. The forward and rear groups advanced in unison, cutting through the enemy lines. Explosions ripped through the night as they destroyed the enemy's provisions and gunpowder. The flames, driven by the wind, soon engulfed their tents as an inferno would drive their enemies into disarray. Griffith called for a retreat, but as they fled into the night, Guts spotted the glint of armour in the distance. It was a cavalry unit, larger than any they had faced so far. For the first time since joining Griffith's men, Guts felt a fierce sense of loyalty, not to the group, but to the fight itself. And so, wounded but relentless, he fought off the soldiers chasing him, only to have his horse killed. Left behind by the Band of the Hawk, Guts seemed doomed until Griffith, Judo, and Pippin arrived just in time. They raced back to the fort, but as they broke through the tree line, the enemy was met with cannon fire from the Hawk's defences. The mercenaries cheered in victory, though Casca felt torn by Griffith's growing bond with Guts. That night, as they celebrated, Guts sat apart, still distant from the group, and so Pippin dragged him into the celebration. For the first time, Guts drank with the mercenaries, earning their respect. respect. Caucus, however, watched with jealousy, whilst Griffith flashed Guts a smile for his formidable work. The next morning, Guts was once again sat alone when Judo found him. He asks Guts what he thinks of the Band of the Hawk, to which he admits that they feel different, more like a family than mercenaries. And so curious, Guts asks Judo about Griffith, but he struggles to answer, saying only that Griffith has a magnetic pull, drawing people in to help him achieve his grand ambitions. Suddenly, a voice calls for Guts, telling him that Griffith wants to see him. He finds him bathing in water before noticing the strange necklace that he wears. Griffith explains that this is called a behelit, or the egg of the king, a talisman said to help its owner achieve world domination, though at a terrible price: his own flesh and blood. In spite of this necklace creeping the heck out of him, Guts asks Griffith why he came back to save him during the battle, which is when he shares his dream of ruling his own kingdom. He reminds Guts that he now owns him and will decide when Guts' life will end. As the brutal swordsman ponders Griffith's ambitious dream, Rickett and Pippin find him and congratulate him on Guts' new role, leading a group of 10 men despite only being here for less than 2 weeks. 3 years later, Guts, now 18, is still fighting alongside the Band of the Hawk. On a vast battlefield, two mighty armies collide: the forces of Midland, led by their king, and the armies of the rival kingdom of Tudor. Amongst the enemy was the Black Sheep Iron Spear Knights, who carved through Midland's ranks with brutal efficiency. After yet another charge, the Black Sheep spots a lone Midland soldier in the distance. Dismissing him as a fool trying to show false bravery, their leader commands a wedge formation and charges. But as they draw closer, the lone soldier is revealed to be none other than Guts. With ease, he slices through their formation, cutting down the leader and shattering the wedge. This opens a path for the Band of the Hawk to charge in and turn the tide of battle. With the area secured, Griffith exchanges a brief, knowing glance with Guts before leading the Hawks back to the fortress to celebrate their victory. As the soldiers prepare for a night of drinking, Casca interrupts and asks to speak with Guts alone. She scolds him for disobeying the plan, as he was meant to serve as a decoy, not face the enemy head on. Initially dismissive, Guts' temper flares when Casca accuses him of being little more than a rabid dog, chasing after fights recklessly. Nonetheless, before this confrontation could get out of hand, Griffith appears and diffuses the situation, speaking to Guts in private. The lone soldier explains that despite his wild actions in battle, he does care about the Band of the Hawk. Later, the band receives high honours for saving Midland's forces, as Griffith is knighted and given the title of Viscount by the King of Midland. While the rest of the band celebrates this new status, Casca notices that Guts is absent from the ceremony. Instead, she finds him training alone in the courtyard, focusing on the only thing he knows: his sword. However, his life was about to be met with a dark and twisted destiny that Guts could never escape. By now, he had risen to the rank of raid captain, commanding his own squad of mercenaries within the Band of the Hawk. One day, Griffith, Casca, Caucus, Rickett and Judo and the others watch from a distance as Guts leads his men in an assault on a Tudor-occupied castle. Tension rises when Judo shares a chilling rumour about a legendary warrior known as Nosferatu Zod. He was thought to be immortal and is said to be allied with the Tudor forces. The name alone sends a ripple of uneasiness through the group, as Zod's reputation stretches back for centuries, reaffirming his immortal status. However, Guts began growing impatient. He had sent 50 men into the keep, but none had returned. His second-in-command, Gaston, advises Guts to request reinforcements from Griffith, but refuses, determined to handle the situation alone. Suddenly, a survivor stumbles out of the keep, half of his body mangled beyond recognition, with his last words being Nosferatu Zod. Ignoring his men's concern, Guts orders them to stay behind and enters alone. Inside, he is greeted by a gruesome sight: the brutally torn apart bodies of his fallen soldiers. As he ventures deeper, Guts finally comes face to face with the infamous Nosferatu Zod, a massive hulking figure with animalistic features, wielding an enormous blade. Without hesitation, Guts charges in for the kill, but Zod's inhuman strength easily knocks him back. That was when Guts realised he was facing a foe unlike any he has encountered before. As Zod's blow crashes down, the sheer force is enough to shatter nearby pillars, but Guts deflects them, despite his muscles straining under the pressure. Realizing that this isn't a fight he can win through endurance, Guts steels himself for one decisive attack. He swings his sword with all his might, just as Zod brings his own blade down in a final clash. In an instant, Guts slices the top half of Zod's sword clean off, but before he could follow through, Zod blocks the strike with his defenseless body. For the first time, Zod offered genuine praise. No one had ever wounded him so deeply before. Yet even with a wound that would have killed any ordinary man, Zod showed no signs of stopping. Gripping Guts' blade with his bare hands, he yanks it from his wounds and with a feral growl begins a horrific transformation. If he wasn't monstrous enough already, he most certainly was now, as he became a giant, lion-like beast that towered over Guts. The monster went in for the attack as Zod's massive fist slammed into the opponent, sending Guts hurtling through a pillar. When he finally comes to his senses, he dodges frantically, barely avoiding Zod's relentless attacks as the beast demands that Guts fight back. Summoning every ounce of his strength, Guts makes a desperate attempt, swinging his sword at Zod's horn, but the impact is pitiful. He retaliates with a brutal strike, knocking Guts into yet another pillar, this time leaving him bloodied and too exhausted to even move. Zod, towering over his fallen opponent, sighs in disappointment, though he offers Guts one final commendation for his resilience. Before he could finish him off though, a barrage of arrows rained down on the monster's back. Griffith had arrived with the Band of the Hawk, determined to save Guts. Despite this, the arrows merely enraged Zod further. Effortlessly, the monster tears through the soldiers in a brutal massacre. Seizing the moment, Griffith rushes to Guts' side, helping him to his feet. His pride wounded as much as his body, Guts seethes at the idea of being saved. But before they can escape, Zod blocks their only exit, refusing to let them leave alive. Thus, the two circle Zod to confuse him, where in the chaos, Griffith lands a clean strike, severing one of Zod's arms. Roaring in fury, he retaliates by lashing his tail, striking Griffith with enough force to knock him unconscious. Then, in a grotesque display of power, Zod grabs his own severed arm and clubs Guts with it before reattaching it to his body. Turning his attention back to Griffith, Zod prepares to finish him off, lamenting that it's a pity to kill someone so capable of wounding him. But as Zod approaches, his eyes catch the sight of the crimson behelit hanging around Griffith's neck. In that one fleeting moment, Zod's emotions ran rampant. From rage to shock to amusement. He recognized this artifact, and so, with a twisted laugh, Zod punched through the roof, sprouting massive bat-like wings. Before leaving, he delivers a chilling prophecy to Guts, that if he truly considers himself Griffith's friend, he will meet an inevitable death when Griffith's dream is shattered. With those final words, Zod takes flight, vanishing into the sky. Guts, shaken by the demon's prophecy, is met by a furious Casca, who blames him for Griffith's injuries and warns him to stay away as she tends to her fallen leader. In Windham Castle, two noblemen mock the Band of the Hawk's claim of encountering a monster on the battlefield. Sarcastically, they ask Guts if the so-called monster gave him his injuries, to which he responds by pressing his crutch onto the nobleman's foot, silencing the other with a cold glare. From there, he links up with Casca, Judo, Pippin, Corcus and Rickett, waiting as Griffith recovers from his wounds. The tension between Guts and Casca remains, with neither speaking. Thus, Judo tries to ease the situation, telling Guts that Casca's anger stems from her concern for Griffith rather than hatred towards him. Nonetheless, Guts is stopped from visiting his friend as he's being visited by noblemen and religious officials, and so someone lower class like Guts can't be involved. In spite of this, he ignores their warnings and tries again, dispatching two guards with ease despite his injuries. On his third attempt, Casca personally intervenes, punching Guts in the face. She demands to know why he's so stubborn, causing Guts to storm off. Later, fueled by frustration, Guts trains where Griffith finds him. They discuss the mysteries of the world, wondering about the existence of gods and demons, which is when the topic of Zod comes up, and how the sight of the Behelit caused him to to flee. Guts then questions why Griffith came to save him, recalling a similar incident from 3 years prior. Griffith, after a moment of thought, admits he doesn't have a straightforward answer and wonders why he would need one anyway. Nevertheless, their conversations cut short by the King of Midland and his brother Julius, the second in line for the throne. Griffith greets the king with a courteous bow, but Guts, less willing, only does so after some convincing from his leader and subsequent threats from Julius. The king expresses his belief that enterprising commoners like Griffith are the key to Midland's success in the war against Tudor, rather than relying solely on the established nobility. That's when Griffith notices a girl watching from a distance, who is introduced as the king's daughter, Princess Charlotte. Whilst making her way towards them, she trips, but Griffith quickly catches her. Julius, displeased, strikes him for touching the princess, but Griffith accepts the blow with grace, offering Julius an almost melancholy, evil smile in return. As the king, Julius and their guards leave, Charlotte and Griffith exchange a glance one last time, which is when a feeling deep within both is awakened. Minister Foss then approaches Julius alone, informing him that the royal guard for the upcoming autumn hunt will be composed of the Band of the Hawk rather than Julius's own White Dragon Knights. The news angers him greatly, as this is a job reserved for royalty. Thus, Foss manipulates Julius's paranoia, suggesting an assassination plot to kill Griffith with a stray poison arrow during the hunt. Talking of which, the autumn hunt soon rolled around as the nobles enjoyed hunting foxes under the king's supervision, with Griffith's men acting as their royal guards. Unbeknownst to most, however, Julius had conspired with the crossbowmen to carry out the assassination on Griffith. Elsewhere, despite the rest of the group proud to be serving this honour, Guts feels disdain for the whole affair, thinking that it's a waste of time compared to battle. In the distance, Casca notices Griffith speaking with Princess Charlotte. As they talk, Charlotte expresses her dislike for hunting and war, viewing both as outlets for men's cruelty. Griffith doesn't respond directly, but plucks a leaf from a nearby tree, showing Charlotte how to whistle with it, as the two continue to flirt with each other. Suddenly, knights drive a wild boar out of the thicket, causing Charlotte's horse to bolt in fear. Griffith immediately chases after her, calming her horse in a ravine away from the rest of the hunting party. The shaken Charlotte quickly regains her composure thanks to Griffith, but at that moment, a crossbow bolt pierces his chest. Griffith collapses with the Band of the Hawk rushing to his aid. As Casca tends to him, Guts interrogates Charlotte, frustrated by her inability to explain the attack. Thus, he searches the forest but finds nobody. Griffith urges them to calm down and removes the poisoned bolt from his body, revealing that the Behelit protected him. The Hawks marvel at this good fortune, though Guts senses something more. This was now twice this necklace had saved Griffith from what should have been certain death. Nevertheless, as Charlotte apologises, realising she may have been the target, Griffith catches sight of Julius, instantly recognising him as the mastermind behind it all. Back at Wyndham, Julius rages over the failed assassination, knowing it has only boosted Griffith's reputation rather than kill it. Later, Guts meets with Griffith, who admits that victory in battle alone won't be enough for his dreams, further adding that they carry out an assassination of their own. He knew it was Julius who orchestrated the attack, as the poison on the arrow was rare, only procured by a knight under Julius's command. Therefore, that evening, Guts, armed and cloaked, stands outside Julius's manor. He infiltrates, watching Julius train his young son Adonis in harsh swordplay, reminding Guts of his own childhood. Later, Julius, alone by the fire, senses a presence. But before he can react, Guts emerges from the shadows, killing him. However, the bloodshed that night had not ended yet, as suddenly Guts noticed a witness. Acting on Griffith's orders, he strikes only to discover he had accidentally killed young Adonis. The weight of having killed a child then begins to sink in, as Guts is spotted by two guards whom he swiftly dispatches. He fights his way through the guards until he leaps over the perimeter wall, getting struck by a crossbow bolt in the shoulder. Nonetheless, Guts escapes into the sewer, hitting his head on a stone and losing consciousness. In a dream, Guts fights his younger self against Gambino. Suddenly, a monstrous silhouette like Zod beheads his adoptive father and stabs the younger Guts. The figure is revealed as Guts himself, mirroring his recent act with Adonis. But bleeding from his head, Guts then wakes up in pain, struggling to find a way out of the sewer. Back at a Wyndham tavern, Casca, Judo, Corcus, Rickert and Pippin drink together, wondering where Guts had gone. Moments later, he stumbles in, dirty, bleeding and exhausted, asking for Griffith. He, however, was at a banquet with Charlotte. Nevertheless, Guts, despite his injuries and smell, made his way there. Griffith and Charlotte step away from the party for a quiet moment by a fountain where Griffith offers her a seat on his cape. Guts ascends the stairs to reach him, but is stopped by Casca, who refuses to let him embarrass Griffith covered in blood and grime. Furthermore, she takes Guts' dagger, cuts a strip from her sleeve, and bandages his wound. Up by the fountain, Griffith reflects on the earlier conversation about men's brutality, suggesting they fight to preserve their dreams. He shares his belief that every person needs a purpose, a statement that resonates deeply with Guts, who is still searching for his. Charlotte admits that she thought Griffith was noble-born due to his grace and marvels at how he seems noble yet approachable, wondering if this is why he inspires loyalty. Griffith then speaks about the importance of friendship, explaining that whilst his comrades are devoted allies, a true friend is different. They are an equal, someone with their own dream who would oppose anyone, even Griffith, to protect it. Words which move Guts to his core. Suddenly, a maidservant arrives to inform Charlotte of her uncle Julius's death, leaving her distraught, causing Griffith to let loose a subtle smile. Knowing that the news found its way to his leader regardless, Guts quietly leaves, leaving Casca puzzled. Nevertheless, the pivotal battle of the 100-Year War approaches as Griffith prepares to leave for the battlefield. On his way out, he's intercepted by Minister Foss, who hints at the deaths of Julius and Adonis, suggesting a demon's work. However, Griffith dismisses this, saying that it was a work of a man. Foss then brings up a new theory about Griffith's near assassination, suggesting that it was an insider job rather than an attempt on Charlotte by Tudor. Griffith feigns surprise, but Foss knows that he didn't fall for his bait to admit involvement. And so as Foss leaves, he considers using others in Wyndham who resent Griffith. In Wyndham's main hall, Casca sees Griffith but stays back as Charlotte rushes over. She gives Griffith a lodestone carved as a knight, saying it will draw him safely back as she holds the matching piece. She asks Casca, hiding behind a flower pot, to protect Griffith in battle, worried that she will never see him again. But after they leave, Charlotte's stepmother, the Queen, scolds her for associating with a commoner. Elsewhere, Griffith rallies the Band of the Hawk as Guts thinks of his idea of a true friend, preparing for the battle at hand. Under a dark sky, the Band of the Hawk faces the Tudor forces. Casca silently suffers abdominal pain but reassures Judo that she is fine. Thus, Griffith orders the charge and the battle begins. Though the Hawks excel, Casca struggles due to her pain. A massive Tudor officer, Adon, confronts her, mocking her position as Griffith's commander. This infuriates Casca, who attacks, but Adon blocks it with ease, knocking Casca off her horse. Weakened, she struggles to fight back, and so Adon offers her a position as her army's harlot in exchange for surrender. Nonetheless, Casca refuses and accepts her fate. But just as he's about to strike, Guts arrives, blocking the blow, questioning Casca on her unusual behaviour. Impressed by Guts' ability to block his attack, Adon attempts his ultimate technique. In spite of this, Guts swiftly brings his sword down, severely wounding Adon and scaring him off. The danger wasn't over yet though, as Casca collapsed near a cliff edge. Guts reaches to catch her, but is struck by an arrow from Adon, causing both Guts and Casca to fall deep into the stream below. Amid the chaos above, Guts pulls her to dry land, resuscitating her as rain begins to fall. Unable to climb the cliff and faced with Casca's worsening fever, Guts finds a cave for shelter. Back on the battlefield though, Judo and Gaston report Guts and Casca's fall to Griffith, but due to limited numbers, no search party is permitted to be sent, regardless of if they want to or not. In the cave, Guts tends to his wounds, seeing Casca shivering, thus he removes her wet clothes for warmth. Discovering she's menstruating, he realizes her pain and how Adon beat her so easily. Nonetheless, with Casca cradled for warmth and his sword by his side, Guts prepares to endure the cold night together. Meanwhile, she dreams of her first encounter with Griffith, who told her joining him was her decision. But before she could decide, she woke up to find Guts squatting at the cave entrance. She noticed he covered her with leaves, realizing that she'd been stripped. Thus, she angrily punches Guts, throwing armor at him. Frustrated, he tells her that he would retaliate if she wasn't a woman, making Casca tear up, recalling Adon's earlier taunts. Realizing he offended her, Guts tries to console Casca, only to be attacked by her once again. In the end, Guts Guts does manage to calm her down, giving her his dry shirt. Disheartened that Guts had saved her, Casca told the story of how she grew up in a poor village, sold to a nobleman by her parents. When she tried to assault her, Griffith intervened, tossing his sword to Casca, who used it to defend herself. Afterward, she asked to join Griffith's band of the Hawk, allowing her to choose her own path. This was the moment that Casca's admiration and loyalty spawned from. As she continues her story, Casca explained how the band of the Hawk grew rapidly in size and success, despite being led by a commoner, to the point where they eventually became involved in a dispute with a wealthy feudal lord known for his predatory behaviour towards young boys. Though disgusted by the lord's child slaves, Casca found reassurance in Griffith. After a battle, he, Casca and Pippin found a dead boy who had recently joined the band. Though Casca didn't know him, Griffith was deeply affected, realising that the boy had died for his dream. This changed Casca's perception of Griffith from her idol to something more complex. A few nights later, she saw Griffith with the feudal lord, who invited him to his room. The following morning, Casca found him bathing and learned that he had slept with the lord in exchange for a war chest to support the band's growing cost. As Griffith scratched at his arms, tormented by his choices, Casca interrupted by embracing him, helping him regain his composure. She concludes that Griffith isn't naturally strong, but forces himself to move forward despite losses, an ambition she strongly admires and wants to be a part of in his quest for his dream. Casca then begins recounting the Band of the Hawk's first encounter with Guts. Before meeting him, her goal was to become someone Griffith couldn't achieve his dream without. However, that changed when he actively sought to recruit Guts, something he had never done for anybody else. She notes that whilst Griffith is typically composed, he becomes impulsive when it comes to Guts. This reliance, combined with Guts' habit for tackling problems alone, has nearly costed Griffith his life several times already. Thus, Casca resents that the person Griffith relies on most seems to care the least about his dream. As she helplessly sobs into Guts' chest, they overhear nearby soldiers, hunting them for the bounty that Adon placed on their heads. Remaining silent, Guts gives Casca a remedy for her fever, preparing for an escape at dusk. While searching for a way up the cliff, Casca collapses from the pain and fever, but Guts encourages her to push on, reminding her that their enemies won't care about her struggles. But just as they start moving again, Guts notices an arrow flying towards them and pushes Casca to safety. They had walked straight into an ambush. Adon, with his face bandaged from his earlier defeat, declares his plan to capture Guts for torture and Casca for pleasure. However, together, they easily dispatch a few soldiers standing back to back, as Adon orders his men to swarm them. Guts uses his immense strength and large sword to cut through multiple enemies at once, whilst Casca, smaller and more agile, swiftly and efficiently kills them. The pair manage to regroup, but Adon calls for his younger brother Samson, a giant of a man wielding a massive flail who swings wildly at Guts. As Casca watches, she realises he's deflecting Samson's blow to protect her, not himself. She also notices blood seeping from his armour as Adon points out that Guts' arrow wound from before has reopened. But despite this injury, Guts tells Casca that he's going to clear a path for her to escape through. When Samson attacks again, Guts shatters the flail instead of deflecting it, then swiftly kills Samson by cleaving his head into two. With the path cleared, Guts urges Casca to flee, but she refuses. Realising their plan, Adon orders his crossbowmen to fire at her, causing Guts to intercept the arrows. As he pulls the arrow from his arm, he tells Casca not to misunderstand. He only protected her so that she could return to Griffith. Thus, Casca makes a run for it, promising to return with Griffith and the others to rescue him. As she flees, Guts blocks the soldiers from pursuing her, killing anybody who tries. Realizing that he's too powerful to face alone, the soldiers hesitate. In spite of this, Adon orders them to attack, and so reluctantly they all charge at once. Meanwhile, Casca, still weakened by the pain and fever, trips in the forest and notices more soldiers chasing her. Though she raises her sword to defend herself, she's too exhausted to fight effectively and continues to run. But back at the battle, Guts continues cutting down Adon's men, even catching a crossbow bolt with his bare hand. Nonetheless, Casca's pursuers catch up, and despite her struggle, they overpower her, knocking her down and attempting to violate her. In desperation, she remembers Guts' words, finding a broken branch, stabbing one of the soldiers in the eye. Just as she reaches for her sword to continue the fight, Judo and other members of the Band of the Hawk arrive to save her and Guts. Before they arrive though, Guts has no choice but to persevere in this mismatched battle which he senses will last until the morning. At dawn, the band find a battlefield littered with bodies, but none of them are his. Rather, Guts is slumped against a tree with yet another arrow in his shoulder. Casca rushes to him fearing for the worst, but his sarcastic response reassures her that he's okay. The medic warns him that he'll be out of commission for the rest of the campaign, but Guts' refusal to stop fighting worries Casca. Later that night, as the band celebrates their return, Judo pulls Casca aside, explaining that Griffith had ordered a search party despite objections, saying Guts and Casca were vital to the band. Moved by Griffith's concern, Casca receives a gift from Judo, elf dust from a travelling elf he had met in his entertainer days. Thus, she runs to find Guts and tends to his wounds. Whilst doing so, he reflects on the difference between his actions and those of Griffith and Casca. Whilst fighting 100 men might seem impressive, he doesn't see it as noble compared to fighting for a dream. Guts then tells Casca that many of the Band of the Hawk fight for their own dreams, but ultimately join Griffith's because it burns brighter like a great bonfire. However, Guts feels his own fire is different, making Casca realise he plans to leave them. In spite of this, Guts assures her that he'll stay until the campaign is over. Their moment, however, is interrupted by Rickett and Pippin, who announce that Griffith rushed back to camp upon hearing that Guts and Casca were safe. Later, during the siege of Doldry, a strategic Tudor stronghold, Midland's forces suffered heavy losses, which is when news reaches a Midland general that Tudor's elite and most powerful Holy Purple Rhino Knights are heading to attack Midland's battlefield headquarters. You see, Doldry was once part of Midland, but it was annexed by Tudor during the 100-Year War. As time went on, it became a focus in the ongoing conflict, and with Tudor weakened by a succession crisis, the King of Midland saw an opportunity to retake the castle. At a war council, Midland's generals argue over the next course of action, whilst Griffith remains silent. When asked if he could take Doldry, Griffith calmly responds that he could, but only with the Band of the Hawk. His bold claim shocks the room, prompting the king to ask Griffith if he's serious. He reaffirms his confidence, stating he doesn't need the full Midland army. His audacity stuns everyone, but they agree that even if Griffith fails, it won't damage overall morale or resources, and so ultimately, the king orders Griffith to mobilize his men and prepare for the mission. Generals Owen and Laban, optimistic about Griffith's potential, plan to observe the battle. They acknowledge that if successful, Griffith could be recognized as the hero of the 100-Year War. Meanwhile, in the Band of the Hawk's camp, Guts remains unfazed by these difficult odds, confident in his and the group's ability to achieve the impossible, as they always do. While the others share their opinions, Casca stays silent. When Guts asks why, she reveals that the man holding Doldry, Genon, is the same noble Griffith once slept with for funding, which is when Guts realizes Griffith's decision to take the mission might actually be influenced by this. Meanwhile, inside Doldry, Adon, who survived his previous encounter with Guts by playing dead, meets with General Beskoggin, leader of the Holy Purple Rhino Knights. He demotes Adon in disgrace for his failure, before then meeting with Genon, who informs him of their upcoming opponent. Excited to face such a renowned enemy, Beskoggin is eager for battle, but Genon orders him to capture Griffith alive rather than kill him. And so, in the calm before the battle, Judo and Guts converse. Thanks to the elf dust he provided, Guts' injuries have now nearly healed. Furthermore, despite the imposing size of Doldry, Guts is confident that if Griffith has a plan, then that plan will win. Meanwhile, Beskoggin has stationed his troops outside Doldry, prepared for the oncoming assault. He doubts the wisdom of Griffith placing his troops between Beskoggin's forces and a river, seemingly leaving them with no escape route, although he briefly wonders about the rumoured connection between Griffith and Genon. In spite of this, he decides to focus on the task ahead, intent on victory regardless of Griffith's fate. Inside Doldry, Genon is consumed with the thoughts of Griffith. He considers himself fortunate to face the White Hawk once more, driven by his obsession and lust for him. And so as Griffith moves ahead to lead the charge, Guts reflects on the possibility that this may be his last battle with the Hawks. Nonetheless, Griffith gives the order to attack as Guts lowers his visor, determined to subdue his emotions for now. However, Beskoggin is perplexed when the Band of the Hawks splits their already small forces into two, but he remains undeterred. Guts leads the first half of of the band straight through the Holy Purple Rhino Knights, charging headlong at Buscoggin, who braces for impact. Their clash is fierce. Concerned that Buscoggin might kill Griffith, whether it be intentionally or not, Genon hastily arms his bodyguards and leads them into the fray, determined to personally take command and ensure that Griffith remains alive. Meanwhile, Griffith himself orders the Band of the Hawk to retreat towards their headquarters, a move that confuses the enemy and even Guts. Once Buscoggin's knights give chase, Griffith halts the Band of the Hawk, forming ranks along the river. Meanwhile, Casca, hidden in the dust, assembles the other half of the band, with Tudor's forces totally unaware, with Buscoggin's knights drawn far from the fortress. And so Casca leads her forces through Doldry's gates, locking it down to stop any word of their arrival reaching Buscoggin's men. However, Casca's raid faced an unexpected obstacle: Adon, determined to avenge his brother Samson. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, despite the overwhelming odds, Griffith's forces hold strong, with Guts single-handedly preventing Genon's soldiers from reaching their leader. And so Buscoggin steps in to face him personally, their clash being a blinding storm of steel too fast for the surrounding soldiers to even comprehend. Guts, now deeply fatigued, compares the battle to his previous fights with Zod and Anon's 100 men, but even in this dire moment, he remains determined. Back inside Doldry, Casca was fully recovered from her period, meaning her rematch with Adon was totally one-sided. Thus, he throws himself at her feet, begging for forgiveness. Bewildered by his grovelling, Casca hesitates just long enough for Adon to shoot her in the shoulder with a concealed, poison-tipped crossbow. Yet the fight is far from over. But even wounded, Casca was not one to be easily defeated. Guts, on the other hand, finds himself weaponless and dismounted. Soldiers from both sides watch on, whilst a mysterious swordsman observes from a distant cliff. Back inside Doldry though, Casca manages to land the killing blow once and for all on Adon, ordering her soldiers to continue the raid. Meanwhile, Buscoggin charges at Guts, who seems doomed until the distant swordsman throws an enormous sword towards Guts. Thus, he's able to block Buscoggin's attack and decapitates both him and his horse in a single swing. And as if Tudor's morale hadn't crumbled enough already, they realised Doldry had fallen to the Band of the Hawk amidst the battle. Thus, it was game over. Griffith's men had won. Thus, Minister Foss decided to meet with 5 cloaked conspirators to discuss him, as the king plans to make Griffith a general, elevating the Band of the Hawk to the highest status regiment in Midland. And so they plan to assassinate Griffith with poison again at the promotion celebration, with the Queen of Midland herself vowing to see the deed done if their initial attempt fails. During the celebrations of retaking Doldry, a guard gives Foss a letter which frightens him deeply. When the Queen inquires, he assures her that everything's fine, but privately he seethes with anger at the true contents of this message. Nonetheless, on the eve of the Hawks' return to Windham, a banquet is held in their honour. Attending are Griffith, Guts, Casca, Judo, Caucus, Pippin and Rickett. Overwhelmed by admirers, Guts escapes, with Casca soon joining him. Before they can continue talking about matters such as Griffith's success though, the King, Queen and Princess arrive, prompting Casca to return inside whilst Guts stays behind, uninterested. The King announces that the war with Tudor has ended in armistice, all thanks to the Band of the Hawk. Thus, he promotes Griffith to General of the newly named White Phoenix Knights, with the entire band set to receive that status of nobility. As the hall erupts with cheers, in an empty corner stands Minifer Fost with 2 of his co-conspirators, watching on as a servant discreetly slips poison into a goblet of wine meant only for Griffith, who accepts it. As the king proposes a toast for Griffith's men, the White Hawk collapses, seemingly dead. Chaos ensues, with Casca and the others rushing to Griffith's side, whilst Princess Charlotte faints. Owen and Laban seal the exits, but Guts, who was outside already, had left. The servant who had poisoned Griffith flees the banquet hall on horseback, but encounters a mysterious swordsman in a feathered hat. With a swift strike, the man beheads the fleeing assassin, revealing himself to be Guts. Later that night, the Queen, Minifer Fost and all their accomplices celebrate Griffith's supposed assassination in a tall tower, as Fost tells them that the assassin had been dealt with, ensuring no loose ends, before leaving to witness the aftermath of their plan. But suddenly, smoke begins rising from the floor. Realizing something's wrong, they try to escape, but no luck. They attempt to smash the door down using a table, only for a blast to destroy it, engulfing everyone except the Queen and a few others in flames. Desperate, Her Majesty rushes to the window for help, only to see Griffith standing below, alive and well. He reveals that the apparent poison was actually a Hyosamus-based nostrum taken in a precise dose to induce a near-death state to the point that it would fool even the doctors, but ensured his safety. He calmly explains that he was always aware of their conspiracy, thus the Queen, furious, refuses to accept death at the hands of a commoner like Griffith. However, in war there are no distinctions between royalty, nobility or commoners amongst the dead. Everybody is the same. Thus, Griffith turns and walks away, leaving his enemies to burn alive. From there, he meets with Minister Foss, who is visibly shaken by the events. Foss struggles with the realization of his betrayal and the murder of the Queen, but more than anything, it is the fear of Griffith that truly unsettles him. He reveals that he sensed Foss's fear from their first meeting, understanding that he could never let him live under normal circumstances, and so Griffith tears up Foss's blood oath to His Majesty, stating that it's no longer needed and suggests that they move forward amicably. He takes Foss to reunite with his kidnapped daughter, who had been taken by 5 hired men at Griffith's order, paid with a single sack of gold. Little did they know though that Griffith wasn't through with them yet. As they leave, the 5 men encounter Guts, still disguised in his cloak and feathered hat, who swiftly eliminates them. Guts asks what to do with the gold, but Griffith instructs him to leave it with the dead men as they had earned it even in death. Despite all these killings though, for the sake of Griffith, his hands remained as clean as ever, prompting him to ask whether or not Guts thinks of him as cruel. He brushes the question aside, reminding Griffith that he too has killed countless men, including 100 on his own. He adds that everything they've done is simply a necessary part of pursuing Griffith's dream, and so the two return to Wyndham, where Griffith shocks everyone by revealing that he's alive. In contrast, the Queen's funeral takes place several days later. Then a month later, on a snowy night, Guts prepares to leave Wyndham for good, but not before Casca catches wind of him. She tries to appeal to their growing bond, but Guts' resolve remains the same. He knows he can't find or fulfill his own dream whilst living under the massive weight of Griffith's. Before long, Judo and Corkus arrive, inviting Guts back to talk things out. Casca, alone in the snow, runs to inform Griffith, hoping that he could maybe convince Guts to stay. Meanwhile, at the local tavern, Judo and Corkus discuss Guts' decision. Corkus criticizes Guts for throwing away everything he has gained with the band, things that they have worked so hard to obtain together. Guts, however, explains that the problem lies precisely in the fact that he only has his status and life because of the band. He recalls Griffith's conversation with Charlotte regarding how a man without his own dream or purpose is unworthy to stand by his side. Guts wants that more than anything, to be his equal, and so it's this desire for self-worth, to no longer be a follower but his own person, that pushes him to make the difficult step of leaving what has become his home. Frustrated, Corkus calls unfulfilled dreams worthless and leaves the tavern. Judo then reveals his past as a former thief and shares his own struggle of never being the best at anything, which led him to follow Griffith. In spite of this, Judo admits that he was wrong about Guts finding his place in the Band of the Hawk and wishes him well on his journey. Before he leaves though, he asks about Guts' relationship with Casca, who decides against pursuing her due to her loyalty for Griffith. Nonetheless, Judo explains that with the war over, Griffith can no longer rely on victory in battle to climb the ranks, meaning he's left with only one path to royalty. His only path to his dream lies with Princess Charlotte. Still, Guts disregards the idea of making a move on Casca for now, but as he tries to leave Wyndham, he finds her, Corkus, Rickett, Pippin and Griffith blocking his path. Guts confirms his intention to leave, thanking the group for their time together, silently smiling at Casca. However, Griffith blocks his way, sword drawn, reminding Guts that he must win his freedom, just as Griffith won his allegiance. And so, reluctantly, Guts draws his sword, despite Casca trying to intervene. Even before the swords clashed, Judo noticed that, due to Guts' growth and Griffith's emotional state, the two were now evenly matched. And so their duel begun, with Guts seeing it as a fitting end end of their partnership. Whilst Casca convinces herself that Griffith will win and everything will just stay the same, she comes to realise how much she actually wants Guts to stay. Griffith, sensing his resolve, understands that he must win immediately, fearing what might happen if the duel drags on. Therefore, he prepares to end the battle in a single strike. Nonetheless, in a swift exchange, Guts' powerful strike shatters Griffith's sword, stopping just short of his shoulder. Defeated, the seemingly unbeatable White Hawk drops to his knees as Guts calmly walks away without a goodbye. He believes that his departure will be nothing more than just a minor setback for Griffith, who will eventually move forward like he's always done before. But how wrong he was. Rather, this was a moment in history that changed everything. Now alone, Guts camps in the woods. Feeling uneasy without the band, he starts doubting his decision, which is when suddenly he senses an overwhelming presence. Reminding him of Zod, Guts swings his sword but finds nothing. Moments later, a mysterious horseman clad in skeleton armor appears. The figure, the Skull Knight, warns Guts of an event called the Eclipse, set to occur in a year, predicting tragedy and death for not just him, but also his comrades, before then vanishing into the darkness. Meanwhile in Wyndham, Princess Charlotte is startled when Griffith knocks at her from outside the window. Letting him in, breaking down with worry of what happened to the Queen, Griffith makes his move, giving Charlotte a passionate kiss. Initially she resists, but soon gives in to her desire to be romantic with this man, as the two then make love. Meanwhile at their inn, Casca asks if anyone's seen Griffith. Once she learns nobody has, she's overcome with a sense of dread, somehow knowing the man she loves is out of her reach. Thus, Casca goes to Guts' old room and holds onto his broken sword, feeling the weight of his absence. Back within Charlotte's room, despite their lovemaking, Griffith merely thinks of Guts leaving, and it's at this moment that one of Charlotte's maidens overhears and witnesses the two of them through the door's keyhole before running away to report it. Afterward, Griffith is left weeping silently, recalling the wound that Guts had inflicted on him before making a silent escape. That next morning, Charlotte wakes up alone, seeing blood under the covers, realising that she had just lost her virginity. Nonetheless, Griffith didn't get very far as he's captured by the guards. Unable to resist, he surrenders as the king bursts into his daughter's room, discovering the blood. Thus, Griffith is sentenced for torture in a cell deep underground. The king tells him how disappointed he is by his actions, having had high hopes for the young general before whipping him. In spite of this, Griffith remains silent and still. The king continues whipping him as he speaks at length about how he loved his daughter and how Griffith has now stolen his only source of warmth in the world. Griffith then understands why the king never made any wedding arrangements for Charlotte, deducing that he harbours a secret lust for his daughter. His words cause the king to furiously whip Griffith further until he is left exhausted, forcing him to command his torturer to do whatever he wants with him as long as Griffith is alive for another year. Despite him being in perfect condition to be executed now, it seemed fate, and more specifically, that Behelit still had plans for Griffith. As the king leaves, he explains that the Band of the Hawk's high rank will be no more thanks to his treachery. From there, the king visits Charlotte in her room, consumed by the thought that Griffith had seen and experienced every part of it. And so, trembling, the king strips her in her sleep, violating her, causing Charlotte to scream in terror and disgust. At first, he apologizes, but can't fight his lust and continues. She kicks him in the face, injuring his eye, prompting him to flee, blaming Griffith for his actions, which is when the young girl screams for him to save her. Meanwhile, the Band of the Hawk, unaware of Griffith's imprisonment, waits in a field, thinking they are following his orders. But suddenly, Midland's forces ambush them. Casca quickly takes command, organising the band against the attack, orchestrating their escape. Back in his cell, the torturer notices Griffith's Behelit, which mysteriously opens its eyes. Startled, the torturer drops the necklace as Griffith watches it fall and drift away into the sewers. 1 year passes from that day, with Griffith tortured within an inch of his life, Guts alone, and Casca still leading what remains of the Band of the Hawk. Meanwhile, at a distant castle, a noble watches a tournament of knights, warriors and commoners. Amongst the combatants are Valancia, a Tudor war veteran who is swiftly defeated by Sylat. However, Guts enters the ring next and easily overpowers them, blocking all his attacks and sending him flying. The impressed tournament host offers Guts a position, but he declines, only interested in testing himself against strong opponents. The noble then tells Guts about a group of bands led by a skilled female warrior, to which he quickly realizes must be Casca. Exhausted, she tries to examine a map but is fouled by Judo, who informs her that a covert unit reported Griffith's imprisonment in an old underground cell where his screams were heard until about a month ago. Despite this, he encourages Casca to rest, but she breaks down, dropping her food and collapsing at the table. Thus, Judo joins Rickett, Pippin and Caucus in discussing plans to break Griffith out of prison and rebuild the band. Meanwhile, a guard is killed by a sharp throwing ring, as Sylat and his mercenaries, eager to challenge the Band of the Hawk's supposed strength, attacks. Casca assumes command, but during a confrontation, exhaustion strikes. As a result, Sylat pins her down, demanding her surrender. Nevertheless, before he could finish her off, Guts appears, kicking Sylat aside, telling Casca not to give up so easily. His valiant return boosts the Band of the Hawk's morale as he insists on facing Sylat alone. Recognizing Guts as the 100-man slayer, Sylat attacks with Chakram, which Guts effortlessly catches. After a tricky battle, Guts adopts a similar two-handed stance as he did against Zod and shatters Sylat's weapons, forcing him to retreat, vowing to one day face Guts again. But safe for now, he locks eyes with Casca. The celebrations wouldn't last long though, as with Sylat aware of their location, the Hawks had no choice but to find a new camp. Later, at said new camp, the mercenaries update Guts about what has happened since he had left. You see, he was secluded in the mountains training and hadn't heard of the Hawks' problems, but he remarks about how the band still feels familiar, though when questioned by Judo, he admits that wielding the sword is still the only thing that feels true to him. Furthermore, Judo reveals that Casca fell into a coma for 3 days after the battle with the Midland Cavalry, calling out for both Griffith and Guts whilst unconscious, and so later Casca leads him to a secluded area near a waterfall alone. But then suddenly she attacks Guts. Though confused, he manages to block her strikes, but only partially draws his sword, using its exposed blade to defend himself. Nonetheless, Casca angrily blames Guts for Griffith's capture and everyone's downfall, believing his departure led to Griffith's collapse. Guts, initially in disbelief, starts to realize that she might be right. Griffith relied on Guts to pursue his dream, and so without him, he was lost. Their fight then intensifies as Casca manages to wound Guts, but he grabs her sword barehanded, refusing to let go until she pulls it away, with his hand pouring with blood. Casca, breaking down, finally admits that she never truly wanted to be Griffith's sword, but instead loved him. She laments at how Griffith's possible marriage to Princess Charlotte made her realize that she has no true place beside him. Thus, in desperation, she asks Guts to protect the Band of the Hawk in her place before moving to throw herself off a cliff. Guts reacts swiftly, catching her hand just in time, and despite his injuries, pulls her back up to safety. He throws her away from the cliff's edge, and as Casca rises, she breaks down, sobbing into his chest, devastated by how Guts always seems to get hurt for her sake, which is when in a moment of tenderness, Guts kisses her on the forehead. Surprised, Casca tilts her head back as their lips meet in a deep emotional kiss beneath the waterfall. She wonders if by being with Guts, things might change. Thus, they begin to let their bodies do the talking, making love. But as Casca cries out, a wave of trauma overtakes Guts, triggering memories of his abuse by Donovan when he was younger. Disturbed by these flashbacks, Guts suddenly pulls away from Casca, with his mind consumed by the haunting visions. Confused, she calls out to him, but Guts doesn't respond. Instead, lost in his trauma, he reaches out, imagining he's grabbing the neck of his abuser, whereas in reality, his hands close around Casca's throat, forcing her against the tree. Snapping out of it, Guts confesses that he never meant to kill Gambino, explaining his traumatic upbringing to Casca. Shaken but empathetic, she listens to Guts, but upon touching his shoulder, he flinches. Because of this, he apologizes for ruining their moment, offering to leave. Casca, however, accepts him fully, throwing his cape aside and hugging him from behind, before once again making love. Afterwards, the two fall asleep in each other's arms after taking their relationship to a new level. The next morning, when Casca asks if Guts' return means that he will stay with the group, he clarifies that he's only visiting, still intent on leaving eventually, recalling the past year of his training. He remembers his time with a young girl named Erica who helped him as her father was a swordsmith living in seclusion due to the area's rich ore which once belonged to the elves. Guts reflects on his journey, firming his resolve to live for himself, wielding his sword not for others but for his own path. Then back in the present, Guts tells Casca that he'll stay until Griffith is rescued, but then he will continue on his own journey. She becomes frustrated, realizing that both men that she loves will ultimately leave her, which is when Guts asks her to join him, as the two share yet another kiss. Unbeknownst to them though, 3 days earlier, a monstrous serpent-headed beast was spotted in the woods, as an unstoppable chain of events were now ready to change the world forever. Back in the darkness of his cell, Griffith's mind was broken. It reached a point where even he didn't know if he was sane. He didn't even know how long he'd been without light, and so he reflects on his dream and how after he beat him, Guts' face shines brighter than anything else. But suddenly though, a brick in the wall moves. From the opening, a small, deformed mass of flesh emerges, addressing him as Prince. As Griffith peers through the hole, he finds himself looking into another dimension with 4 mysterious, otherworldly figures inside. One of them call him Kinsman and King of Longing, saying that they will soon meet at the appointed time. Meanwhile, the Band of the Hawk prepare for Griffith's rescue as Casca divides the mission into 2 squads. The rescue squad consisting of herself, Guts, Judo and Pippin, and another squad led by Caucus to handle other tasks, where together they ride towards Wyndham. 3 days later and they had arrived. Thanks to a mole, they knew of a secret passage to Griffith's cell. Thus, Guts, Casca, Judo and Pippin descend into the tunnel. As the rescue team makes their way, Guts reflects on his time with Griffith and how he would never give up before emerging in a mausoleum where they'd been met by 2 hooded women. One reveals herself as Princess Charlotte, accompanied by her handmaiden Anna. It turns out that Charlotte had been their mole all along. The group, now joined by Charlotte, continues their search for Griffith, with Casca wondering if he's lost interest in the princess after all his torture, realizing that she's still jealous. Suddenly though, 2 guards overhear their voices. Guts and Judo prepare to fight, but Charlotte uses her influence along with a bribe from Anna to defuse the situation. They soon reach the towering ancient structure known as the Tower of Rebirth, where Griffith was imprisoned. Judo advises Casca to keep Charlotte around as a potential hostage, but Charlotte, overhearing, volunteers to join them on their mission herself, regardless of the potential dangers, as she no longer sees the king as her father anymore. Casca finally agrees to let Charlotte accompany them, but only on the condition that she leaves if Griffith orders it. And so as they prepare to enter the Tower of Rebirth, Casca admits to feeling jealous of how Charlotte speaks about Griffith. Realizing that she'd actually hurt Guts' feelings saying this, she tries to apologize, but he flinches away from her touch, brushing it off as he orders the group to keep moving. In spite of this, Guts reflects that he too needs to break free from Griffith's shadow. Nonetheless, Judo stealthily kills 2 guards and grabs their keys. Meanwhile, back at the Band of the Hawk campsite, the mood is as hopeful as ever, thinking of Griffith's inevitable return. Thus, Rickett, who is tending to the injured, is sent to fetch water from a nearby lake. As he bends down, he notices a strange glowing figure hovering over the water. In a flash, the creature flies to shore, startling Rickett, who briefly thinks that he's seen an elf. However, as it darts towards the camp, Rickett, fearing an enemy attack, rushes back. Upon returning, he finds the camp eerily empty. The wounded band members were all gone. The bonfires had nearly been burnt out, and an unnatural darkness blanketed the area. The camp was totally devoid of life. It was the eve of something terrible. Suddenly, Rickett spots one of the Band of the Hawk members hanging upside down from a tree. He struggles to speak but manages to urge Rickett to run. But before he could even react, an enormous slug-like monster emerges from the shadows. Frozen in terror, it only gets worse, as Rickett is surrounded by more grotesque monsters. But just as the horrors close in, the Skull Knight suddenly appears, saving his life. Without hesitation, he orders the monsters to leave, sending them slithering back into the darkness from where they came. And so finally able to scream, Rickett does so, overwhelmed by the nightmare unfolding around him. He frantically searches the camp, only to find his comrades, every single one of them, dead and piled up. As Rickett lets out one more horrifying scream, the Skull Knight silently departs, leaving him utterly alone in the blood-soaked, silent camp. Meanwhile, as Casca, Guts and the others descend deeper, Guts carries a frightened Charlotte on his back, a decision that visibly annoys Casca. Meanwhile, as Casca's group continues, Charlotte explains that whilst the prison and the tower above are relatively new constructions, the enormous hole itself dates back thousands of years, to the time of an emperor named Gaiseric. He was a conqueror who united the warring tribes of the land that would become Midland, creating an empire. Little is known about Gaiseric's origins or how he raised an army, but Charlotte mentions that he was always depicted wearing a skull-shaped helmet in battle. The mention of this immediately reminds Guts of his encounter with the Skull Knight. Judo picks up on the story, explaining how Gaiseric ordered the construction of a grand capital city where he ruled his empire with heavy taxation and iron authority. However, the legend says that God sent 5 angels to punish his tyrannical reign, destroying the city overnight and casting it deep underground. Casca corrects him, confirming that there are in fact 4 angels though, and not 5. Charlotte finishes by explaining that the ruins of Gaiseric City lie at the very bottom of the hole beneath the Tower of Rebirth, and that the current Midland royal family is said to be the last of his bloodline, which is when Casca stumbles, as the torch she's holding slips from her hand, falling into the deep abyss below. Strewn around the ruins are decaying bodies, each one bearing a strange symbol carved into their foreheads, a symbol that they would soon become all too familiar with, the brand of sacrifice. But they finally reached the end of the staircase and arrived at Griffith's cell. Charlotte rushes forward, banging on the door and calling for his name, but there's no response. She raises her lantern, but even that barely helps. Furthermore, the air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, but that was when suddenly Guts spots something on the floor, a naked body laying face down. It was Griffith. A metal helmet resembling his white hawk mask was fixed to his head. His skin in places had been stripped from his body, the nails in his hands and toes likewise, his tendons slashed and tongue removed. And so one thing was very clear: if they didn't do something soon, their leader would never again be a man capable of achieving his dreams. Thus, Guts demands Casca stays back, knowing that what Griffith had become would tip her over the edge. But just then, the cell door slammed shut as Griffith's torturer appeared, boasting about the horrors he inflicted on him over the year. Enraged, Guts smashes through the door and impales him, cutting out his tongue before sending him plummeting into the abyss below. As the guards then swarm the staircase, Guts prepares for another fight, ignoring their demands to surrender. He tells the group to stay close behind as he clears a path, killing one guard after another. Soon the entire squad of soldiers lay dead at his feet. Thus Casca orders Pippin to carry the weakened Griffith, and upon reaching the entrance to the Tower of Rebirth, another group of guards awaits. But suddenly the door explodes, and Guts once again emerges, facing the next wave of enemies. A volley of arrows nearly strikes them, but the king orders his guards to hold back, fearing for his daughter's safety. Upon seeing Griffith on Pippin's back, the king collapses in fury, convinced that she's running away with them. And so, in complete desperation, the king calls for the deadly Bakiraka assassins. Their orders: kill Griffith, but leave Charlotte unharmed. Meanwhile, the rescue team catches up to Guts, who, bloodied and exhausted, had been fighting off more soldiers. Seeing Charlotte's fear at Guts' appearance, Casca gently wipes the blood from his face, with Griffith noticing the growing relationship between the two of them. As they head into the escape tunnel, a Bakiraka assassin swoops down from the ceiling like a spider, but Guts blocks the attack in time. Casca then spots another lurking underwater, narrowly blocking his attack. As they regroup, Judo warns the group about who the Bakiraka are, so-called inhuman monsters. But just then, Charlotte sees another aiming a blowgun at Griffith, and without hesitation, she jumps in front of the dart, taking the hit and collapsing into the water. After Guts kills one of the Bakiraka, another proposes a deal: hand over Charlotte in exchange for her life, as only they have the cure for the poison flowing into her body, to which Casca reluctantly agrees. Once she is gone, the Bakiraka launch a full attack as the group rush to protect Griffith. As weapons clash, sparks fly, giving Judo a plan. He extinguishes the torches and uses the sparks from his knives striking the walls to locate the Bakiraka, allowing the group to strike and kill the assassins once and for all. Before they relight their torch though, Pippin notices an odd smell, which is when a female member of the Bakiraka ignites a spark that causes a massive explosion. Luckily, Griffith spots a small glimmer of light above, alerting Pippin, who smashes a hole into the ceiling with his hammer. The explosion is then sucked out, saving the group as they rush towards the graveyard exit. The Band of the Hawk, with their now broken leader back, had managed to escape. However, the emotional and physical nightmares that they had experienced were only about to get worse. Meanwhile, back in the Midland Palace, the female Bakiraka is executed by the king for failing on her mission and allowing Charlotte to be harmed. Charlotte, however, pleads with the king to let Griffith go, arguing that his year-long imprisonment was punishment enough. He agrees, but secretly has no intention of letting Griffith or his men go. Thus, the king orders the Black Dog Knights, a savage group of soldiers, to hunt them down. However, Wild, the monstrous leader of the Black Dog Knights, initially refuses to go as he has more important business to attend to. But when he learns that their target is Griffith, he's ecstatic, as it turns out that was the exact business he had planned to take care of anyway. Now, 5 years earlier, Midland was desperately in need of soldiers, and so in an attempt to bolster the army, the king recruited able-bodied convicts, forming a new unit. Wild, a small yet intimidating figure, volunteered to lead them, whilst Barbo, a much larger and imposing man, challenged Wild's claim to leadership. The king then authorized a duel to determine who would command the Black Dog Knights, with the fight ending with Wild throwing Barbo onto the spire of a tower with complete and utter ease. Ever since then, the king has felt an eerie, almost inhuman aura surrounding Wild. Thus, with them now hunting Griffith, the king believes they stand no chance of escaping. Meanwhile though, just outside Windham, Griffith's rescue team hides at a small farm where they're tended to by kind-hearted farmers who still admire Griffith and the Band of the Hawk. But with him now bandaged and weak, he's placed in a cart provided by the farmers, along with new clothes for the group and their horses. Soon after, Wild and the Black Dog Knights arrive at the same farm, seeking information on Griffith's whereabouts. Nonetheless, they proceed to destroy the farm, assaulting and slaughtering everyone who had helped Griffith and his companions. Which is when suddenly Casca spots figures in the distance, noticing their pursuers have impaled the mutated bodies of the farmers on their spears, brandishing them as trophies. Shocked and disgusted, Casca recognizes the group as the notorious Black Dog Knights. They spot a bridge leading into the forest where the rest of the Griffith rescue force is stationed. But with the Black Dogs closing in rapidly, it's clear that they won't make it in time. Thus, Guts turns his horse around and declares that he will buy them time. Casca, remembering the last time she left Guts to face overwhelming odds alone, worries for him. Likewise with Pippin, who decides to stay behind as well and fight alongside Guts. The two warriors make quick work of the black dogs that charged them, cutting through their ranks with ease. Yet no matter how many they kill, more just keep coming, driven by the sheer terror of their brutal leader. And so soon Wild himself enters the fray, throwing a spear that Guts manages to deflect. They engage in close combat, with Wild catching one of Guts' powerful sword swings with just his bare hand. The immense strength and furiosity reminds Guts of both Zod and the Skull Knight. And so hearing Casca's voice, Guts and Pippin retreat across the bridge. Wild, sensing a trap but relishing in the chaos, leads his men in pursuit. As the Black Dog Knights flood under the bridge, Casca lights the fuse connected to barrels of gunpowder, causing the bridge to explode, sending the Black Dogs and Wild crashing into the depths below. But despite this temporary victory, Guts pushes the group to keep moving forward, knowing that Wild's pursuit is far from over. And he was right, as Wild and a small group of the Black Dog Knights emerged totally unscathed. He shows no mercy to one of his soldiers who questions the traps ahead, crushing the man's skull with just 2 fingers. And so as the Hawks press on, Guts reflects on the eerie sense of doom that has followed them ever since Griffith entered their lives. He recalls Zod's grim prophecy of Griffith's downfall and the Skull Knight's warning about the coming eclipse, realizing now that both foretold the same event. But just then, massive boulders are released onto the advancing Black Dogs, which Wild punches through with his bare hands. More traps await them, explosions triggered by hidden hawks, flaming oil set ablaze, and volleys of arrows launched by Corcus and Gaston's horsemen. And so when the group's main forces finally emerge from the forest to meet the enemy head-on, Casca, Judo, Guts and Pippin safely fall back to join them. As the chaotic battle unfolds, Guts turns to face Wild directly. He knows the only way to end the bloodshed is to settle things with the monstrous leader himself. Wild gazes at him with a wicked grin, remarking that Zod once spoke of a fierce warrior amongst the band of the Hawk. Meanwhile, Casca, after handing Griffith over to a medic, joins Judo and Pippin in the fight, but her attention remains on Guts' intense duel with Wild. He quickly realizes that this monster fights without any formal training, relying solely on raw strength and instinct. At one point, Guts seems to land a strike, only to be stunned when Wild catches the blade in his teeth, grinning with blood-soaked gums. Guts then leaps from his horse after Wild kills it with a single punch to its face, where in midair he yanks his sword free from the monster's mouth, kicking him off his own horse in the process. For a brief moment they exchange taunts, but when Wild mentions the ominous eclipse, Guts charges at him with fury. Meanwhile, Griffith, hidden beneath the roots of a large tree and guarded by 2 loyal hawks, tries in vain to grasp a nearby sword, realizing he is utterly helpless. But back in the battle, Wild delivers a devastating kick to Guts, sending him flying. Yet, he rises to his feet, eyes burning with determination. Wild, delighted by this challenge, laughs maniacally as they prepare for the next round of their fight. In spite of this, his men call to retreat. Thus, with a single devastating blow, Wild punches through a tree's trunk, causing it to collapse and crush his own army. Deciding to escalate their fight, Wild discards his club, sending it flying into the face of one of his own soldiers. To the horror of the band of the Hawk, he begins to transform. His already imposing figure grows exponentially, his body becoming monstrous. His lower half mutates into what looked like a grotesque headless gorilla, with Wild's original torso acting as the head. The new body was equipped with a large gaping mouth in its chest and 3 bulging eyes, one on each shoulder and a third running down his abdomen. Guts immediately recognized the transformation as something similar to Zod's, a sign of Wild's terrifying true power. Now in his new form, this monster uproots a massive tree with ease, using it as a weapon. With just one swing, he sends Guts flying through the air, his body crashing violently into the forest, dropping unconscious. And so Wild then turns his attention to Casca, leering at her with a predatory gaze. Just as he reaches out to grab her, a barrage of arrows fly into his monstrous body. However, they do little more than irritate Wild, who casually plucks them from his skin. Then, holding the tree horizontally like a battering ram, Wild charges through Judo's archers, sending them scattering in terror. As the situation continues to spiral out of control, they realize they stand no chance against this beast. But in the midst of the retreat, Griffith, being lifted by the medics, notices Casca kneeling beside Guts' unconscious body, desperately shaking him, trying to wake him up, as Wild turns his attention back to her. Stripping her, he plans to use his grotesque stomach tongue to violate Casca. But just when all hope seemed lost, Guts regains consciousness and, without hesitation, plunges his sword through Wild's tongue, severing it completely. He roars in pain and shock as Guts takes advantage of the moment, delivering a powerful slash that cuts deep into Wild's arm. The agony forces him to drop Casca, who quickly retrieves her sword. Before she can act, however, Guts urges her to leave. His first reason, delivered with his signature sarcasm, is that her near nakedness would be too distracting for him, but his second, more serious reason is his need to settle a personal score with them, the monstrous apostles that have been haunting his life, starting with Wild. The monster, growing tired of the battle, lunges at Guts with the intent to end things with his next attack. But despite the fear coursing through his veins, Guts forces his body to move, narrowly dodging the blow. He retaliates by plunging his sword deep into Wild's mouth, before then swiftly pulling it out with a powerful swing. As Wild continues his assault with furious punches and kicks, Guts evades each attack with agility, waiting for an opening. When it comes, Guts slashes at Wild's legs, forcing the giant to kneel. The Band of the Hawk watches in astonishment as Guts, battling alone, appears to be winning against this otherworldly being. He leaps onto Wild's massive body, driving his sword through its abdomen. However, he quickly traps Guts, and with a brutal throw, Wild sends him smashing through branches until he hits the ground, spitting up blood. No longer toying with Guts, he leaps into the air and lands just inches from him. As Guts is flung through the air, Wild delivers a bone-crushing backhand, sending him hurtling into a thick tree branch. He hangs there, motionless, whilst the members of the Hawk begin to fear that Guts had been killed. Griffith, despite his grievous injuries, struggles to move towards Guts, driven by sheer determination, with his lips bleeding as he grits his teeth in agony. However, as he hangs there from the tree, Guts recalls his time training with Erica by the waterfall. Erica had questioned why he trained so relentlessly when his enemies were only human, to which Guts had thought of Zod. She asked if he truly wanted to face such a monster again, warning him that no man could stand up against such a thing. But suddenly, Guts woke up. With a desperate surge of energy, he slashes upwards, cutting through the giant's central eye, damaging it greatly. Wild staggers, clutching his injuries, whilst Guts stands tall, bloodied but driven. Guts racked his brain for a way to defeat Wild once and for all. Every muscle screamed in protest, and he knew that one more hit could spell the end. Yet, there is no plan, no clear path to victory. Guts simply has to win. From the sidelines, Casca tries to rush to Guts' aid, but Judo holds her back. He knows that Guts isn't done yet, even if the battle looks hopeless. Meanwhile, Wild closes in and kicks Guts, who raises his massive sword to block, yet the sheer force of the blow sends him skidding across the ground, with his sword cracking and chipping. At this point, Guts knew that both his body and his weapon couldn't withstand another strike like that, and so as he struggles for a solution, his eyes fall upon the lifeless body of a black dog knight nearby. And so as Wild stalked through the forest searching for Guts, who was hidden, his predatory eyes fall on a figure behind a tree. But before he could act, a falling leaf tips him off to movement above. With one swing, Wild cleaves through both the tree trunk and the dead black dog that was propped up against it. He spins quickly, launching a crushing punch at his attacker in the air, only to realise that it was too late. He had struck a log clad in Guts' armour. And so from the shadows, in a split-second move, Guts drives his sword deep into Wild's neck. Still alive, he roars in agony, thrashing violently as Guts holds on for dear life. With sheer will, he climbs onto Wild's back and pulls out his dagger, viciously stabbing Wild in both his heart and remaining eye. In a final act of defiance, the monster slams his back into a tree, dislodging Guts and sending him crashing to the ground. Both warriors were now left broken, but Wild, drained of all his strength, collapsed. For a brief moment, silence falls over the battlefield. Then Casca, unable to contain herself, runs to Guts. She finds him laying on the ground, his body limp, but when he glances up at her with a faint smile and raises a thumbs up, her heart floods with relief. The battle was finally over, and for now, they had survived. Back at Windham Castle, Charlotte wakes up in her bed and immediately asks about Griffith, with Anna reassuring her that more than half a day has passed since his escape. And since then, there have been no reports of his recapture. Once alone, she recalls a promise Griffith made during their escape, a promise to return which she clings to with all her heart. Her thoughts are interrupted, however, when Charlotte spots a figure in the afternoon sky. She squints, thinking that it's a bird, but quickly realizes it's something far more ominous. A humanoid figure with large black wings and horns. A further sign that a world-altering event was just over the horizon. Meanwhile, the Band of the Hawk was struggling with the aftermath of the brutal battle against Wild. The remaining members were still recovering, with Guts' body battered and stitched up, whilst Griffith, Fail and Broken sit silently. He notices Casca tending to Guts' wounds, resting her head on his shoulder. Once finished, she welcomes Griffith back to the Band of the Hawk before returning to her duties. Outside, Judo pulls Casca aside and delivers the devastating news that Griffith's injuries are so severe that he can no longer walk or even hold a sword. This revelation hits Casca hard. She quickly excuses herself to focus on ordering the mercenaries, her mind reeling from the implications of Griffith's condition. Nearby, some of the uninjured members have gathered around Wild's enormous corpse, marvelling at its size. After a few minutes, they start to disperse, returning to their tasks, but one soldier lingers just a little bit longer. His attention is drawn to Wild's hand, which he swears twitched for just a moment. Shaking his head, he decides to dismiss it as nothing more than just a trick of his mind. And so, inside the cart, Guts lies beside Griffith, reminiscing about their previous battle with Zod, trying to lift the mood a bit. Guts then asks if Griffith wants his heavy metal mask removed. Instead of answering though, he tilts his head back, his gaze falling on his old armour. Guts, understanding the unspoken request, helps Griffith don his old armour anyway. But that's when, in the depths of the forest, Wild re-emerges, leaving behind a trail of blood and carnage. Guts, after confirming with his own eyes that Griffith's days of swinging a sword are long gone, he grabs a nearby one of his own, hearing a commotion outside. But before he can even react, Wild's enormous hand crashes down, obliterating the cart in a single blow. As he snatches Griffith, he lifts the once proud commander high into the air like a ragdoll. Wild demands that no one moves, threatening to kill Griffith on the spot if they do. His wild eyes dart around as he mutters about the Vortex, a mysterious force that seemingly terrifies him. Thus holding Griffith aloft, Wild orders him to use the Behelit to summon the Guardian Angels, aka the God Hand, claiming he needs their power to save him from death. And so Griffith thinks back to the vision he had of the 4 ominous figures peering at him through the hole in his prison cell wall. Nonetheless, Wild strips Griffith of his armour and bandages, leaving only his iconic hawk-shaped mask. Wild's words then cut deep as he declares that Griffith is as good as dead, unfit to lead anyone. His insults demoralise the band members, however Guts, filled with rage, grips his sword tighter, ready to fight back, but Wild's grip on Griffith means that one wrong move could mean the end of him. Growing impatient, the monster reaches around Griffith's neck, searching for the Behelit himself to summon the God Hand, but realises that it's gone. Suddenly, a massive presence descends from the sky, landing behind Wild. Standing taller and more imposing than anyone, the fearsome Nosferatu Zod emerges. And so for the first time, Wild looked genuinely afraid. He could only muster a few words before Zod impaled him with the sharp horns atop his head. However, even in his dying state, he refused to let go of Griffith. Thus, Zod lifts Wild into the air, and in this grim moment, Griffith is suspended between the two monstrous beings, his frail body hanging just feet away from Zod's fearsome face, locking eyes with the legendary Apostle. Wild, barely able to speak, asks Zod if he is acting under the command of the God Hand, and in his final moments, he recites the one law that governs apostles like them: "Do what thou wilt." Wild gestures towards Griffith, referring to him as the Fifth One, a title that puzzles the Band of the Hawk but seems to hold significant meaning for Zod, who remains unfazed and replies that if Wild's life or death is of no consequence to the God Hand, then he will die here, tearing him apart. Guts leaps into action and catches Griffith, however Zod turns his attention to the Band of the Hawk. He addresses their leader, foretelling that a prized possession of his once lost will soon be found again, before then taking to the sky. Guts, unable to control his frustration and confusion, shouts after Zod, asking if Wild's attack was the beginning of the eclipse and the unavoidable death that he once foretold. Zod offers no clear answer, only stating that all will be revealed soon. As the Band of the Hawk regain their composure, all eyes fix on the lifeless body of Wild as something begins to stir from within. From the gaping wound of his stomach, a nightmarish mass of tentacles and deformed figures begin to emerge. The band watches in horror as the grotesque mass pull at Wild's limbs, dragging them inward, collapsing the monstrous body in on itself. Guts watches, realizing that this is the very vortex of terror that he'd feared. And so when the steam clears, the band sees the true form of Wild, the man he once was before succumbing to his monstrous transformation, a small, frail old man. Nonetheless, with the Hawks a mere shadow of their former selves, they move to a glassy plain near Midland's border, with Griffith's future weighing heavily on them. The truth has hit them all hard as they mourn the end of their dreams. The members realise Casca's capable leadership over the past year, and so they consider her as Griffith's successor, who announces that she'll lead only until they regroup with the injured unit, unaware of what has happened to them. After dismissing the group, Casca shares a quiet moment with Guts. She tells him that whilst he's found his own path, the others still rely on Griffith's dream. Thus, leaning into Guts' shoulder, she confesses her loneliness in leadership. Unbeknownst to them though, Griffith, awake, watches them through the cart's flap. As she goes in to change his bandages, Griffith stares intently at Casca, who lays eyes upon his once strong hands with a firm grip on greatness, which are now reduced to complete fragility and weakness. Distracted by this, she accidentally knocks over a bowl of water, when Griffith suddenly forces himself upwards, throwing his body against hers. Startled, she tries to lift him off, but after a moment of hesitation, lets him remain there. Meanwhile, Guts and Judo sit together in a field. He asks Guts what he plans to do when the band disbands, but he has no answer. Judo shares that he might form a small band of thieves to look after Griffith and playfully declines Guts' offer to join them, saying that he's already bound for something far greater. He then suggests that Guts takes Casca with him, but their conversation is cut short by Gaston and the Raiders, who asks Guts if they can follow him once more. Seeing their loyalty, Guts realizes he still belongs with them, but his eyes turn towards Griffith's wagon, where Casca sits visibly shaken. When Guts approaches, Casca quickly stands up, masking her distress, telling him that Griffith is asleep. However, Guts notices that something isn't right. Thus, Casca tearfully leans into him, admitting that she can't leave Griffith behind. She sees both the great warrior he was and the broken man he's become, feeling bound to stay by his side. Nonetheless, she insists that as Griffith's friend, Guts must leave and pursue his own path, even if he has to go at it alone, as the two share a silent, painful understanding that their paths are beginning to diverge once again. Overhearing their conversation, Griffith pretends to be asleep, where in that silence, a strange vision overtakes him. He finds himself in an endless white void, seeing a healthy, triumphant version of himself, the proud Griffith of old, standing in his shining armour. The other Griffith slams a sword into the ground, pointing at a distant castle, the one from his childhood memories. Slowly, the frail Griffith grabs the sword's hilt, using it to lift himself to his feet. Suddenly, his child self darts past him, laughing and calling him to continue their game before running towards a bright light in the distance, with the weakened Griffith desperate to join him. Meanwhile, Guts and Casca noticed Griffith's cart jerking into motion. Casca realizes that he might have overheard them and somehow managed to spur the horses himself. Guts leaps into another cart to pursue him, whilst Casca runs back to rally the band. Griffith urges the horses to go faster, chasing after the vision of his childhood self. But when the cart hits a rock, he's sent flying through the air. But in that instant, another vision comes to him. This time, a healthy Griffith sits under a blanket, gazing at Casca, who gently scolds him for daydreaming. Their home is modest but warm, with the Band of the Hawk's insignia hanging on the wall. Casca mentions missing the members, wondering aloud if Guts is still fighting somewhere, which is when a boy runs past outside playing with their dog. Casca addresses the boy as Guts, telling him to come and wash up for dinner. She kisses Griffith's cheek and feeds him a spoonful of soup, and for a moment he lets himself sink into this vision of peace. But suddenly he catches sight of the Behelit emerging from the soup. Thus, Griffith jolts awake, now lying in a shallow river. He lets out a tortured laugh before spotting a sharp branch on a nearby log. Crawling over, he positions his neck above the point, pressing down until the pain intensifies, only to pull back at the last second. He collapses, thrashing in despair as the sun sinks lower, casting shadows over him. Thus, reaching down into the riverbed, Griffith finds his crimson Behelit, once again hanging from his wrist by its string. Everything had built up towards this very moment. Zod's prophecy of a lost treasure returning echoes in his mind, as does Wild's urging to summon the God Hand with it. Then, all at once, Guts, Griffith, and the approaching band notice a strange darkness settling in the sky, a black shadow slowly devouring the sun. An eclipse. In that moment, blood from Griffith's neck trickled down to his hand, soaking the Behelit, which began to open its eyes. Guts shouts to Griffith, but in his mind he begs him not to come closer. Suddenly, he notices bizarre, distorted figures, silhouettes of naked men and women standing all around the riverbank. Their bodies, though human-like, are twisted and unnatural, as if part of some otherworldly vision. Determined, Guts jumps from the cart, splashing into the river. Meanwhile, Griffith's mental pleas for him to stay back grow desperate, but Guts approaches, placing his hand on Griffith's shoulder. It's at that moment the Behelit's face rearranges, twisting in agony as it sheds tears of blood. Suddenly, a silent scream fills the air as the world around them warps. In an instant, the entire Band of the Hawk were transported to a new dimension. Here, the sky is crowded with the shapes of spectres, shadows of human faces mingling in an ominous dark haze. The ground around them also transforms into a landscape of grotesque hill-sized faces frozen in expressions of despair and agony. And so, if it wasn't clear enough to Guts already, the eclipse he was warned of had begun. Elsewhere, Rickett, still dazed and haunted by his encounter with monsters and the school night, rides towards Midland's border in a caravan of travelling entertainers. Nonetheless, he manages a quiet thank you when an elf named Puck, travelling with them, offers him a small pouch of elf dust. Before Rickett parts ways though, Puck visits the caravan's fortune teller, who glimpses at a sinister omen in his path. In spite of this, with a heavy heart, Rickett steps out onto the plains, watching the eerie eclipse above, feeling a dreadful unease about his friends. Meanwhile, the band are paralysed with horror as they stare out over the eerie terrain. Casca, though horrified herself, snaps into leadership, shouting commands to her soldiers to steady them. Guts carries Griffith back to the group, placing him on a horse, where he notices the Behelit. But what shocks Guts the most is the blood now trailing from Griffith's own eyes, matching it. The disoriented soldiers then notice the strange, naked figures from the river standing on a massive face nearby. In an unsettling chorus, they explain that they are within the eclipse, a cosmic event occurring every 216 years, ominously hinting that the 4 angels of God, known as the God Hand, will soon arrive. Suddenly, one of the massive faces from the ground rises, morphing into a towering woman with enormous black feathered wings that gradually transition into leathery bat-like appendages. Her hair twists into tentacles as her transformation finalizes, moaning in ecstasy. The Band of the Hawk watches in horrified awe, but then above them, mocking laughter echoes as they see a singular face descending from the sky. As they watch, another face in the ground behind them rises, pulling surrounding faces into its body to form a rotund figure with clasped hands and a cruel grin. One mercenary points frantically at the eclipse, where swirling darkness is coalescing into a monstrous silhouette. Slowly, 4 grotesque entities materialize. Guts' instincts scream danger as he watches these new beings, these demons, be worshipped as gods. The last of the 4, a tall, slender figure with hollow eyes, greets the band of the Hawk, calling them lambs of the unholy god and welcoming them to the sacred nocturnal feast. His skeletal figure points directly at Griffith, addressing him as kinsman and the honourable child of causality. That's when Griffith's eyes widen in a flicker of recognition. He realises that these beings are the same ones he saw during his imprisonment. Guts, seeing Griffith suffering, tightens his grip on his dagger and faces down the God Hand. He mocks them for speaking in cryptic riddles, defiantly proclaiming that Griffith is no demon. In spite of this, the demonic entities laugh as the winged woman praises Guts' loyalty, claiming it will make him an excellent sacrifice. That's right, Guts and the rest of the band are to be sacrificed, all so that Griffith could join his demon kinsman. The smallest of the God Hand members, a malevolent, childlike figure, steps forward and explains that Griffith's Behelit found him because he is uniquely qualified to ascend beyond mere apostleship and become something far greater. And so, gesturing to the rows of people standing between the God Hand and the band, it reveals that these beings are apostles, creatures like Zod and Wild, who have also used Behelits to transform into monstrous figures. Griffith's Behelit, however, is no ordinary artifact. Known as the Egg of the King, it holds the power to elevate him to the rank of the God Hand itself. However, Griffith's transformation will require a sacrifice, specifically the lives of his allies. Then, on cue, each apostle morphs into their monstrous transformations. As the chilling reality of the situation sets in, Guts turns to Griffith, desperately questioning if he truly intends to sacrifice his comrades. And though he remains silent, Griffith stares at the God Hand, seemingly torn between the allure of their promise and the weight of the necessary sacrifice. One member of the God Hand explains that Griffith's journey, and indeed the lives of everyone present, has been shaped by causality, all leading to this predestined moment, the invocation of doom. With that pronouncement, an enormous hand begins to rise from the ground, outstretched towards Griffith. As he's slowly lifted up, Guts is dragged along as well, and whilst they create a platform for Griffith, they make no such effort to aid Guts, who clings to Griffith's hand as his only lifeline. However, as pain shoots through his broken arm and his grip weakens, Guts slips, plummeting down the side of the giant arm before catching his fall midway. Determined, Guts begins his painful ascent, where above him, Griffith reaches the palm of the hand, where the God Hand members have each taken their places on one of the giant fingers. Only the index finger remains unoccupied, an ominous sign of the role Griffith is destined to fill as he faces the final test of his own resolve in the presence of his dark destiny. The leader asks if he feels fear or anticipation for the future that awaits him as one of them. Unable to respond physically, Griffith's silence is met with an eerie gaze from the smallest member of the God Hand, who swoops down towards him, declaring that to see the path forward, Griffith must first confront the path he has walked. Thus, Griffith finds himself transported to a vision of his past. He's a child again, running through the silent, empty streets of his childhood city, following the bells that echo in the emptiness. He heads towards the castle but finds himself lost. Eventually, he encounters an elderly wool spinner who, when asked for directions, tells him how to reach the castle and reminds him that his friends await him there. As he runs deeper though, darkness engulfs him, before suddenly his foot lands on something soft. Looking down, Griffith sees that he's standing atop a massive pile of corpses. Panicked, he tries to pull himself away but slips and falls, coating himself in the gore of the dead. Trembling, he looks up to find the wool spinner watching him, asking why he's surprised, as this path that he's on, the one leading to his dream, has always been lined with death. She points ahead to a distant gleaming image of the castle, whispering that had he never set his sights on it, these sacrifices wouldn't have been necessary. Nonetheless, Griffith protests, claiming that he never forced anyone to follow him, but she retorts that this dream of his has always demanded sacrifice. That's when the corpses form a ramp leading to the Shining Castle. However, if he truly wants to reach it, Griffith will need more bodies to stand upon. The elderly woman asks if he's willing to abandon his dream to avoid further death, or if he will push forward, now knowing what it requires. As Griffith hesitates, taking in such a tragic truth, he glances down to see his hands and legs decaying. He knows that he simply cannot abandon his ambition now, despite the pain and cost of it, and so determined, Griffith rises, bending down to lift the child's body, the young Hawk member who had died so long ago. Understanding his resolve, Griffith moves forward, ascending into the heavens, with the God Hand ready to welcome him into their ranks. They ask Griffith if he still wants to pursue his dream, promising that should he desire it, he will be gifted raven black wings to soar towards that elusive castle, but only if he's prepared to sacrifice his comrades to the darkness. At this critical juncture, Guts completes his relentless climb and reaches Griffith, who turns to face him, his gaze full of deep, conflicting emotions. In this moment, Griffith acknowledges Guts as the one person who made him forget his dream, the one friend that brought him peace. But the only thing stronger than peace is Griffith's own ambition. Thus, with complete sincerity and certainty, he utters his final answer to the God Hand. I sacrifice. In an instant, the hand closes around Griffith, sealing him away from Guts. The tallest God Hand declares the beginning of the promised time, as a fiery brand flies through the air, marking each member of the Band of the Hawk. The brands sear themselves painfully into their flesh. It was a brand that they had all seen once before. It was the brand of sacrifice. With their bodies marked, the apostles turn their hungry eyes upon them, ready to usher in the birth of the new child of darkness. Trapped in the unholy ceremony, the band realise that their loyalty to Griffith has led them to the edge of a horrifying fate, with their lives now fuel for his ascent to godhood. This was not the dream they realised that they were fighting for all along. The apostles tear through the band with ease, as limbs and bodies are torn apart, devoured and tossed aside, all part of this nightmarish feast. Seeing Griffith fall deeper into the darkness, Guts frantically tries to break through and reach him, yet his strikes seemingly meaningless against the unholy power holding his friend captive. The God Hand look on, bemused, taunting that no mere human strength can alter Griffith's fate now that he's made his decision. Thus, Guts sinks to his knees, haunted by memories. Moments where Griffith's ambition had hinted at the potential for such a sacrifice, where slowly he begins to accept the truth. As a result, Guts rises to his feet, ready to fight with only the broken dagger, determined to take down as many apostles as he can. Elsewhere, Rickett approaches the band's camp, feeling a chill run through him as he sets eyes upon a massive inverted tornado of darkness. Confused and fearful, he rushes towards the chaos, calling for the band, but hearing only the monstrous howls of wind. Suddenly, a sharp clash rings out, breaking through the storm's roar, and so Rickett looks up to see two distant figures locked in a fierce battle, Nosferatu Zod and the mysterious Skull Knight. It's revealed that the Skull Knight has fought inhuman beings like him for over 1,000 years and views the eclipse as his chance to challenge the God Hand. Zod, however, uninterested in weak sacrifices, instead anticipates the arrival of strong warriors like the Skull Knight, whom he claims as his rival. Meanwhile, in the midst of the massacre, Casca stares horrified as apostles devour her comrades. One apostle lunges for her, but Pippin intercepts, smashing it with his hammer and urging her to escape. Judo then rides in, sweeping her onto his horse and throwing knives to keep the apostles at bay. Both prioritize Casca's survival, knowing that she is the band's last hope. However, when she looks back, she witnesses Pippin become too overwhelmed by the apostles. Likewise, Caucus watches as fellow soldiers are devoured. He tries to flee, but a swipe from an apostle sends him rolling down a hill of faces, deeper into this nightmare. Desperate, he convinces himself that this is all a dream, praying to wake up just as a beautiful woman appears, drawing him close by, before eating him. Casca and Judo continue to race through the nightmarish landscape, away from Guts and Griffith, questioning whether they're in hell, or if this is the dark dream that he had wanted. Nevertheless, Judo takes down 2 apostles, but a third catches him by surprise, clamping its jaws around his arm. Casca quickly stabs it, freeing him, but his arm is badly mangled. Thus, she urges Judo to turn back and die fighting with the band, but he insists that she might survive if they press on. But suddenly their horse's legs are severed by a hidden apostle, sending them tumbling. Surrounded by more monsters, Judo shields Casca with his body. With what little remains of his strength, he throws a knife into its eye, allowing Casca to finish it off. As she helps Judo up though, he admits that he's not as resilient as Guts, but he presses forward regardless, gazing at her as his vision fades, regretful that he never told her that important thing. That he was in love with her, but never built up the confidence to say it. Thus, with his last step, he collapses in her arms, lifeless. Grief-stricken, Casca has no chance to mourn though, as she faces the advancing apostles alone. Elsewhere, Guts charges into the horde, hunting him, despite the overwhelming odds. Observing from above, the female Godhand member muses on the irony that Guts' relentless will only strengthens Griffith's transformation. However, for a moment, Guts is caught, yet he charges back into battle, fueled by rage. Meanwhile, Griffith sees himself sinking into a dark, endless ocean where he sees visions of his dying comrades. Though he feels their pain, he remains emotionally detached, totally numb to it all. Then deep in the abyss, he perceives a whirlpool from which countless behelit-shaped bubbles emerge. Amidst this void, Griffith confronts an enigmatic figure he identifies as God, otherwise known as the idea of evil. But whilst their conversation takes place back amongst the chaos, Guts keeps fighting before eventually losing balance, going over the edge of the massive hand. He stabs the wrist with his spike to slow his fall, but sees the apostles crawling down after him. Letting go, he slides down the arm, but an uneven protrusion knocks him off balance, sending him into a freefall. Guts crashes into a pool of liquid, realizing with horror that it's blood, formed from the bodies of his fallen comrades. He calls out for his friends, but there's only silence until Gaston barely speaks up. Missing an arm and barely able to stand, he speaks of a foreboding sense he'd had ever since they first encountered Zod, and how Griffith seemed too flawless. Then, as he grows weaker, Gaston's forehead swells, suddenly bursting as an apostle emerges from his neck, slithering away in the sea of blood before Guts could strike it down. Shaken, he looks up and spots Pippin standing atop of the hill. He races towards him, but realises that something's wrong. This was merely the shell of Pippin, being used as a horrible toy by the apostles. And so after tearing his body apart, the creature lunges at Guts with open jaws, forcing him to leap out of the way. In doing so, he tumbles down a hill, but soon rises to his feet, finding himself surrounded by apostles and the corpses of his fallen comrades. In the midst of this horror, Guts spots Casca suspended high above, stripped and seemingly lifeless. Thus, rage overtakes him as he launches towards the apostles, slicing through their ranks in a desperate attempt to reach her. His fury, however, is halted when one bites down in his arm, immobilizing him. Before the apostles can further torment Casca right in front of him, a thunderous heartbeat reverberates across the battlefield, drawing their attention to the giant hand. Griffith was now dead. What was born from him was his new identity, what his goal had been building towards. He was now Femto. An ominous black figure with a muscular form sculpted into a dark armor-like exoskeleton crowned by his once iconic hawk-shaped helmet. All that remained of Griffith's past identity were his inhuman eyes and blood-red lips. With a powerful flap of his wings, Femto floats down from the giant hand and lands near Guts, who watches helplessly. The apostles fall silent, pausing their torment as Femto turns his attention to Casca. Completely powerless, Guts could do nothing but watch in anger as Femto began to violate her. Thus, driven beyond sanity, he hacks at his own arm with a broken blade, determined to free himself, an act which captures the attention of the God Hand. However, with his right arm now gone, Guts charges at Griffith with rage burning through every fibre of his being. But before he could reach his former friend, several apostles intercept him, pinning Guts to the ground, once again forcing him to watch Casca. She quietly pleads with Guts not to look, but he simply could not turn away. His horror deepened as Griffith's eyes seemingly fixated on both him and her. The violation ultimately ends in silence, with Griffith discarding her motionless body as an apostle drives its claw into Guts' right eye. However, when all hope seemed lost, the eclipse above shatters, casting light through the darkness. From the rupture descends the Skull Knight. He charges at one of the God Hand known as Void, who conjures a portal to redirect the strike back at the Skull Knight. It proved to be useless though, as he effortlessly blocked his own attack. Griffith, newly aware of his telekinetic abilities as Femto, tried to stop the Skull Knight, but he dodges, grabbing both Guts and Casca. As Griffith stares at his hand in fascination, the Skull Knight escapes through the rupture in the sky. The God Hand watch in interest, with Slan noting that whilst the Knight's intervention is unexpected, it will not divert causality's flow. Meanwhile, Zod, having lost, is outside the tornado, unaware that Ricket was hiding nearby. Then the Skull Knight bursts through, landing in front of him, who's horrified by the sight of both Guts and Casca. Thus, the Knight dismounts, entrusting their survival to Ricket, who must tend to their wounds fast. When Zod approaches, he doesn't attempt to fight, but rather is impressed and amused by Guts' survival against all odds, granting them the time to leave before the tornado vanishes, ultimately unleashing the apostles within. Ricket, still reeling from the massacre of his friends, asks about their fate, but the Skull Knight chooses to withhold the grim truth about the role Griffith had to play in it all. Meanwhile, as they disappear into the night, Zod watches on, intrigued to see just how Guts will now navigate this dark, demon-filled world that Griffith had unleashed. In a thick, haunting mist, Guts dreams about the band walking silently towards a mysterious destination. He rushes to them, pleading for them to stop and turn back, but they ignore him. His cries go desperate, begging not to be left behind until his vision fades. Suddenly, Guts jolts awake, finding himself in an unfamiliar cave. Furthermore, his right eye was now bandaged. That was when he heard the footsteps approaching, as a young girl enters the cave, excitedly hurrying towards him. It was Erica. Behind her appears Ricket, glad to see Guts awake. He explains that he'd been unconscious for 4 days, resting in an ore cave near Godot's home, where the Skull Knight had brought him. When Ricket asks what happened in the tornado, Guts is haunted by grief. He tries to sit up, but with great difficulty. Desperate, he asks about Casca, to which Ricket points deeper into the cave towards a waterfall. Guts, barely able to stand, staggers towards her, calling her name, but when he approaches, Casca flinches, recoiling from his touch and crying out. She twists away, yanking her hands free from his grip, and finally bites his fingers in a panic, running to cling to Erica, the only one she trusts. Ricket explains that though Casca's wounds have healed, she's unlike herself. She's now mute and withdrawn, with a childlike innocence that borders on fear. Guts, ignoring Ricket's pleas to stay and rest, exits the cave out into the wild. As he sprints through the dense forest, tearing off his bandages, yelling in agony, his thoughts race from one friend to the next. The supportive Judo and their deep conversation on Guts' first night with the band, Caucus, whose disdain for him was palpable, the silent yet ever-present Pippin, the loyal raiders who adored their commander, and Casca, his true love. All of them, the entire band, was his family, stolen from him by the one they all admired. And so as he continues to run without purpose, his body is torn open again and again, but he doesn't care. All he wants to do is escape the pain of the past. However, as night falls, he collapses in exhaustion. The rain begins to fall as Guts looks up, his mind haunted by the vision of Femto looming in the clouds. Suddenly, a sharp pain cuts through his neck. The brand of sacrifice begins to bleed on its own, as if it was provoked by something. Whispers then fill the air, and from the grass, small translucent creatures emerge. As Guts turns around, he finds the Skull Knight standing there. He explains to Guts that he now lives in the interstice, a place between the living and the dead, causing Guts to realise that this nightmare is simply just getting started. As the grass behind him rustles, the Skull Knight tosses him a brutal spiked sword. Spirits of the dead then rise from the ground, drawn to Guts' brand of sacrifice, seeking to possess his body. Despite the agony flooding his wounds, Guts swings the sword, resisting their hold through sheer will. In spite of all that is unfolding before him, Guts dismisses the talk of fate and curses, vowing vengeance against the apostles, the God Hand, and most importantly, Griffith. But at that moment, the spirits vanish, heading for their new target, Casca. Thus, desperate to protect her, Guts demands the Skull Knight's help as he's lifted onto the horse, setting course straight for Casca, totally unprepared for what was about to happen. Before they arrive, Guts questions the Skull Knight's true identity, who simply states he's an enemy of the God Hand. He brought Guts to Erica in Godot's cave by chance, with it being the closest place to the eclipse, and that the mountain once hosted elves whose lingering influence helps repel spirits. Nonetheless, the two reach a clearing where Casca stands on a hill, surrounded by ghostly spirits, but remains untouched. However, ignoring the Skull Knight's caution, Guts runs to Casca, who sinks to her knees in pain, clutching her stomach. To his shock, a tiny, dark, fetus-like creature emerges from her, a demon child twisted by Femto's assault. The creature opens one eye, staring at Guts, who instinctively tries to kill it, but Casca shields the child, driven by pure maternal instinct. The Skull Knight explains that whilst this child was conceived by Guts, it was corrupted by Femto's demonic influence. The creature, now growing rapidly, clings to Casca's brand of sacrifice, absorbing her blood. But as dawn breaks, the spirits and the demon child fade. However, the Skull Knight notes that this child will return seeking its parents. Thus, he advises Guts that whilst his brand will guide him in hunting the God Hand, he must be prepared to embrace the darkness. With these parting words, the Skull Knight vanishes, leaving Guts, Casca, Rickett and Erica together on the hill. Then 1 month later, two farmers accidentally run their cart into a deformed man crawling on the road. As they berate him, they notice the sun vanish, though the light remains. The man could sense a brand of sacrifice nearby. Meanwhile, at Godot's house, Erica sneaks Rickett into the armory. Amongst Godot's creations, Rickett is awed by the massive Dragon Slayer sword. However, Godot catches them, explaining that the sword was crafted at a king's command to kill a dragon, but deemed useless due to its massive size and weight, making it too difficult to lift, along with the fact that dragons don't exist. Outside, Guts trains to fight with one eye, slicing a fish midair. Later, he tells Rickett that he's gonna leave soon, not revealing his plans to get revenge. But that night, Guts brings food to Casca, but she flinches when he grabs her, sparking a struggle that ends with their clothes torn, and Guts momentarily overtaken by his old feelings for her. Realizing his mistake as Casca cries, he sits, ashamed at how he's treated his lost lover. Nonetheless, the next morning, Rickett helps Guts prepare with a black armor, throwing knives, and a surprise gift, a prosthetic arm with a hidden function. Godot then gives him a new sword, as Guts tests its strength by splitting a blade in two. In that moment though, Guts' brand burns, warning him of the deformed man who had now found him. In the elf cave, Casca cries out as her brand of sacrifice begins to bleed, also sensing this evil presence. Meanwhile, the deformed man reveals himself as an apostle, transforming into a monstrous creature. Godot, Rickett and Erica are terrified, but Guts, fueled by his thirst for revenge, leaps into action. He swiftly drives it out of the house, severing its arm. But Godot's sword just isn't made for this kind of battle, as on the next strike it shatters, leaving Guts vulnerable as the apostle uses its own intestines to grab and throw him back into the armory. As Guts struggles to recover, Rickett shouts for him to activate his new arm's hidden function, firing a cannonball, dealing a powerful blow. But even that isn't enough. Furthermore, his shoulder is now dislocated from the recoil. Thus, Guts looks around for another weapon, spotting the Dragon Slayer, cleaving the apostle's head and torso with a single swing, before finishing the job with one last strike. It was a match made in heaven. This was a sword destined to follow Guts on his revenge-filled quest. And so as he prepared to leave, Rickett tried getting Guts to stay with Casca, whom he hadn't even said goodbye to. Guts, however, turned away, consumed by his need for vengeance against the ones who stole her from him in the first place. Thus, with the Black Swordsman now born, it was time for Guts' journey into a never-ending nightmare to begin.